So, welcome back to S&C Coaches React. Today's not really a reaction. It is a reaction. It's more of a review of 4 of the best YouTube stars, kind of social media stars, and their squats. So, we're just going to look at 4 people, nice, diverse range of people. So, we got Mike Israetel, kind of a general strength. Obviously, he's bodybuilding, but he'll do well for general strength people watching. Ryan Dengler, which has a phenomenal low bar squat for the big fucking giraffes out there. We've got Mattdoesfitness, which is a nice low bar squat for the appropriate size people out there in terms of height. And then we've got Ivan. Ivan is someone who we just really like because he likes squatting every day. And obviously, we hate squat every day, but
we enjoy him as a person.
As a person, Ivan is just someone who Ivan gets after it. We've talked other times about people not training as hard as they used to, and the kind of pendulum is swung a different way. But that's a different topic for a different video. So first up, we're going to start with Ryan Dengler's squat. Okay, so the video we're going to use for this one, if you want to go watch it, is Ryan Dengler's YouTube. It's 1 week out, last heavy training session before openers. Ryan appears to be a powerlifting collegiate athlete.
Yeah, I think Ohio State have a powerlifting team.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
he's a legitimately very athletic person. So the reason we picked his first is because his low bar squat is something that is immaculate.
Yeah.
So he's something around 270, 275 maybe for low bar. So, right, when a lot of people think of low bar, in my head, I think everyone else thinks of West Side.
Today we're going to do some squatting for you. We're going to use bands. It's a contrast reactive method.
Yeah.
Really ultra wide foot stance.
And that's more like geared powerlifting. Like wearing a suit. No, wearing a suit.
Yes.
Using powerlifting gear.
Yes.
Not geared up powerlifters. But this is a very nice squat. It looks nice.
Yeah.
In terms of like a raw low bar, obviously some federations don't call like knee sleeves raw. Mm-hmm. Some do. But I think this is a very, very nice squat. I think for the vast majority of athletes, particularly taller people, like people who might not necessarily be built for squatting, this is a great place to start with your technique.
So his high bar position is at the widest point of his shoulder. Now, we kind of talk about a hybrid high bar, and we might do a different video on that as well, where we get taller people. So doing high bar, it's not a low bar position, but it's not as high as like someone like Gabriel St. Crane would have. So it's a little bit lower. So it keeps that distribution between your knees and your quads, or your knees and your glutes, more even. It keeps the bar over midfoot. Obviously, Ryan is very typical low bar, but the best thing about his squat, right, he hits a lot of the big points. So he has a wide stance, so he's getting to depth faster, I suppose, or reducing that distance. His knees tracking is very, very, very nice. And then he has that hips and knees break at the same time. So he favors his glutes more than, I suppose, if he was a very, very high bar. But that kind of, when his knees break and his hips break at the same time, it's a very, very nice position. His back angle stays very, very consistent. And I think he gets the most out of his body shape. So he keeps a really consistent back angle when he's squatting.
I think the important thing as well for Ryan's squat is if you're like a general strength training athlete and you want to use, like somebody we'll talk about later what Mike uses the high bar back squat as like a hypertrophy exercise. When you're looking for general strength adaptation, like if you're just wanting to do some powerlifting or just wanting to get stronger, a squat like Ryan's here is going to be very beneficial because he's building quads and building posterior chain at the same time. So it's not just this kind of one or the other. Like this is a really, really good general, like if you're a football player or a rugby player, this would be a great squat for you to get stronger at.
We're looking at him squat 612 pounds, surrounded by his NPCs. And what I really like is his back tightness is phenomenal.
Yeah.
You don't see any shitty wriggle in his elbows, so that means his back is staying really tight. It's kind of like an athletic low bar is how I describe it, which I'm a huge fan of that.
He also doesn't have that kind of weird claw mixed grip, suicide grip on the low bar, which if you're not like really specifically powerlifting, you want something like this, like a pretty stacked up wrist, knuckles pointed to the ceiling, and a lot of upper back recruitment.
So I think takeaways for the taller people looking for a low bar that's kind of athletic is his bar placement is over midfoot as much as possible. The style of descent, as I would call it, is very close to a high bar, which is just fairly smooth down. It's not a major drop and it's not a very, very slow negative. It's kind of, I suppose you call it a moderate descent. And he's just keeping that kind of, he's almost dropping in a high bar position, but then getting that parallel, favors his hips a little bit more and probably the most important thing besides the high bar position for the taller lifters, is his foot position is nice and wide. So he's giving his hips as much room as possible to kind of sit in between his legs. So if he was in a typical, so if he had his feet kind of underneath his hips, which we do see a lot of a lot of taller lifters do. Realistically, if you're a taller person, north of 6 foot, it's very tall for squatting essentially. You want to give yourself room for your hips to go straight down. So if you imagine your feet are directly underneath your hips, your knee travel can only go forward so far. So that means your hips are almost always staying behind your heels. So the wider you make your feet, within reason, you give your hips room to drop straight down. And so hopefully that'll keep that bar going straight down.
I think for the powerlifters, like the low bar kind of contingency that are watching this video, there's definitely things you can learn from Ryan's squat as well. A lot of the time when we have people who go down that really specific route, they're really, really low bar, they're really sitting back. Like, there's definitely things you can learn here. The first thing is his quad recruitment. So like the balance between still favoring posterior and still favoring that sitting back position, but also wearing, like, what is he, Nike 3s, so he's a 1/2 inch heel lift or maybe 3/4 inch heel lift. He's wearing SPD knee sleeves and he's allowing his knees to travel forward. His squat's unbelievably strong, right? So this is obviously doing something positive for him. It also has the advantage of, if you're that super specific powerlifter, a lot of the time you see guys low bar back squatting, their quads are pretty small.
Yeah.
Like, they're not looking really jacked. Everyone wants to look more jacked, and the quads is one of the first places you should go to.
I think that points out something that's very, very important for non-equipped, geared or ungeared low bar squatters at the moment. So the reason those kind of geared lifters would have sat back Westside days, Elite FDS, is because they were trying to load up that briefs or squat suit as much as possible to kind of sling them out of the hole. Whereas if you're raw, or sleeves, or whatever you want to call raw, you still want to get your quads involved, because obviously they do huge amounts of that work. Your hips and lower back aren't going to be able to take out a massive load if you're unequipped. So make sure, if you're a low bar, make sure you're still getting your knees involved, getting your knee extensors involved, your quads. They can take a lot of the load, they can do a lot of the work, and they'll keep your bar in a good position. So next up, we're doing Mattdoesfitness. So obviously a lot of people know him from YouTube challenges. He's in immaculate shape. He's a legitimately strong influencer.
Yeah.
Why we picked Matt was because he is a low bar squatter. In this video, it's 265 kilo squat in my home gym, because it's capitalized. So he is someone who is shorter, obviously, than Ryan. So he has still low bar positions, but there's a few little differences that we'll look at here. Okay, so we're just watching Matt do 220 kilos here. He gets up to 265. So you'll notice a couple of differences here compared to Ryan, for example. So obviously, Ryan is a very, very tall lifter. He's got longer levers, long femurs, a long back, obviously. Whereas someone like Matt has shorter femurs and obviously not as strong a back, or less of a back to kind of take advantage of, less hips to get involved. So when Matt is squatting, you'll see it's a very, very high bar positions, but he's still using his upper back, so he's getting as much even distribution among his kind of glutes and quads as possible, while still getting a very legitimate depth and very fast squat.
Yeah. I think what you're going to see here is, like, you see some of those kind of less ideal upper back positions than we had seen previously with Ryan. That definitely comes from, like Matt is absolutely yacked, and he has a strong bench press too. Not that Ryan doesn't, but there's definitely some restriction in the upper back there, which is non-ideal. So ideally, he'd have his hands small bit narrower, he'd have a better wrist position, better hand position, and he'd be able to grip that bar a bit more. That's just one of the kind of negatives of his squat.
So you'll see as well, his foot position is a lot narrower. It's basically underneath his hips, maybe slightly wider. So he's getting a lot of forward knee travel. He's getting a lot of quads involved. So obviously you can see in the 265, you do see his back kind of change a little bit in position, which isn't ideal, but it would have been a lot worse had he been doing a high bar position. So he's still kind of keeping that bar over midfoot. His narrower feet allows for a better kind of quad and glute engagement, so hips and knees are kind of doing what they need to do, and his back is still so if you'd imagine that obviously the higher the barbell goes, the further from the opposite side of the lever would go, so the moment arm would have more force trying to resist this side, so his hips would have to do more work essentially to keep his upper back or torso from inclining over. So the lower he gets that, the further back towards the hips he'll get it, the less work he needs to do for that.
I think Matt would actually have a very, very aesthetically pleasing high bar back squat.
Yeah.
It obviously wouldn't be as heavy for the reason Gerf just mentioned. When you look at the build of him, if he was to put on, like, even he has Addy powers on, which are 3/4 inch. If he put on a pair of Nike Rom 2s or a pair of Antas and put that bar up nice and high in his back, I think we'd see a very pleasing squat to look at.
I think Ryan would have a nice high bar as well.
Yeah.
All right, so next up, we're going to Mike Israetel, right? So Mike Israetel would be, obviously, bodybuilding is his shtick, but it's kind of one we like because it's incredibly aesthetic.
Yeah.
It's ideal positions for a low bar. So there's a couple of things Mike does that are so we just got a couple of Instagram clips here, so there's no particular video in particular. So a couple of things. Mike's obviously range of motion is full. I would call that full range of motion. There is no range of motion left for Mike to get. So he's not wearing knee sleeves, so that's his thing. He's looking for much muscle recruitment as possible through full range of motion. One thing I particularly like about Mike's squat is you can really see it. So he arches his lower back and he sends his hips back, but he still gets a lot of forward knee travel. So sometimes we see people when they're doing high bar squats is they only favor forward knee travel, and so that what you kind of get is a drifting forward of the bar, and the person's center of mass is kind of moving forward over the toes. So knees over the toes is perfect. Knees over toes, guy, take a drink. But what I like about Mike's is that he's still getting his hips involved and his glutes involved. So he kind of curves his lower back. He overemphasizes it, but it obviously works very, very well for him, and it gives him a really nice upper back position. And so we don't see any butt wink as he goes down, and we don't see any butt wink then as he goes up,
Yeah, this is very much classical high bar, super vertical torso. And when you're talking about like application of the squat or application of different styles of squatting, I think people do get a bit mixed up because they're saying, okay, like you'll always see it in his comments, why is he squatting like that? Why is he wearing 2 belts? It's important to note that Mike Israetel isn't using this squat to get stronger or specifically to get better at strength sports. He's using it purely for hypertrophy, quads, some glutes, some posterior, but especially as you watch like the higher rep sets, his quads are getting pumped to the level you don't usually see anyone's quads being pumped. And this is like the skill development that Mike has here, and the specific skill he has isn't really to squat the most weight. It's to be as pointed and as directed towards quad hypertrophy as possible. You'll see him do these squats with a Smith machine, so he's sitting all the way down with the bar being traveled or being guided by those rails. He'll do it with a kind of assisted squat machine, but all the time the mechanics are the same. He still sends his hips back, but it's a lot of forward knee travel. If you're a bodybuilder and you're wanting to do a squat like this, it's not something everybody is going to be able to do. Like even Mike, you'll see him double belting because he doesn't want to gain too much girth around his midsection while still being able to protect his back. You'll also not be able to do this if you have normal length femurs or long femurs. Like this is for somebody who's built for squatting. Like the vast majority of people won't be able to have something that's this aesthetic and that looks this good. And then the last interesting note on this is when you watch Mike high bar squatting, his back position or his upper back position and how he addresses the bar is something that only a really, really, really experienced practitioner is going to be able to achieve. So Mike is obviously jacked. Most bodybuilders will have issues with that external rotation of the shoulders, and you'll see it here, like whether he's using a standard straight bar or a kind of safety bar, he'll always have his hands right the way out to the edge. He'll always have his kind of wrist draped over. The second thing this does, besides allowing him to actually put his arms around the bar without tearing his shoulders off, is it forces him that he can't really lean forward too much at all because he has no control over where the bar is. So the bar is just literally sitting on top of that shelf on his shoulder. He has a small bit of recruitment from that area, the wrist that's sitting on the bar, but mostly he's just really targeting all of that contractile potential into his quads. Nothing to do with his back. He can't lean forward because the bar will roll off.
One final thing as well is you'll probably notice the tempo was vastly different to Ryan and Mattdoesfitness. Obviously, they're trying to get out of the hole as fast as possible, whereas Mike is looking for maximum muscular tension, like Fitz talking about in the lower body. You'll see his descent is very, very low, and it's almost a pause squat, so I'd probably call it a no bounce squat. So he's actively looking for what it seems like is no bounce out of the hole, so no use of the stretch shortening reflex or stretch shortening cycle. He's essentially getting to the bottom, pausing for a very, very short half second, and then coming up again. So he's just trying to not bounce out of the hole. He's not using, I suppose, momentum, I suppose, quote unquote, to get himself out of the bottom. He's trying to get as much muscular involvement as possible and force those lower limbs to do as much work as possible.
He also conserves a huge amount of energy. So you'll see when people are squatting heavy weights and they come to the top of the bar, it'll be like shaking and they'll be moving with the bar. There's none of that. Like the concentric part of the lift as he stands back up is very, very controlled. There's no additional speed, there's no additional power, there's no bending the bar and standing there with the bar shaking. No, Mike is really concentrating on that concentric, really concentrating on well controlled full range of motion squats. So not the best if you're a strength athlete specifically, but definitely the best if you're a person who's looking to gain the kind of most amount of hypertrophy in those muscle groups.
So next up we have Ivan Jerick. So Ivan Jerick is a dude who squats every day. You probably know him best for that. He's, at the time of recording, squatting 547 days a row, which is phenomenally impressive. His max seems to be somewhere around 210, maybe 220 kilos. I'm not sure if he's done that. The reason, there's not a lot to learn, I suppose, from Ivan's technique. Now, there's a lot to learn from Ivan's philosophy, his training style, the way he thinks about training, the way he gets after training. Now, obviously, we don't like squat every day, but we really like what Ivan does. And there's a couple of, my favorite thing about Ivan's squat essentially is just how unadulterated his squat is.
Yeah.
It's just fully raw. Like he doesn't even wear weightlifting shoes or squat shoes.
Just the Converse fat man pants.
Yeah.
Like nothing fancy. It is just a pure squat. Like if you saw this guy training in the gym and not doing the weights he was doing, you'd just think like, oh yeah, it's just
there's no way.
Another guy like, yeah.
So we're just watching this video here. It's learning from the Chinese, day 546. The best thing about Ivan's videos, right, is you should listen to his philosophy around training and how he thinks about things. What I like about Ivan is that when he is doing assistance exercises, he takes assistance exercises as seriously as he does a 1RM squat. Like if he's doing sit-ups, he is doing sit-ups. Like if he is doing his calf raise, he is getting after his calf raises. So I just really like the intensity he brings to his assistance work for his squatting.
I think when you look at the squat itself, rather than all the other stuff around it, where you're going to see is a guy who's not really, really well built for squatting. He doesn't have these phenomenal ranges of motion, so his ankle mobility isn't really good, and he's not wearing weightlifting shoes. But what you see is a really well ingrained motor pattern, so the squat looks the same probably on 546 as it does on the videos I've seen of him doing. And it's just a standard high bar squat with fairly good range of motion. So for all the people out there, like we get messages and questions all the time about, oh, how long is it going to take me to squat like insert Chinese or Asian lifter here? Or how long will it take me to get this range of motion in my ankles? Everyone can go out there and get absolutely bullshit strong with their back squat without having to do all this stuff or without having to get these shoes versus that shoe. Like your 1/2 inch lift or 1 inch lift shouldn't be the thing. Like you shouldn't wait 2 months until you can afford to get back squatting shoes purely before you start training. Like you should just go and start training with what you have now.
If there's probably one small critique of Ivan's squat is that I would just like to see him squat just a little bit wider. Like if he went the width of his own actual feet wider, it would vastly improve his squat. So we kind of bring his hips more into a better position, so it keeps him centered over his midfoot essentially, or over his heels realistically, would be the only thing I would change. But if you don't know who Ivan is, definitely go watch him. If you do, then you'll appreciate his squat. So mostly this is just a shout out to Ivan's intensity rather than his squat technique. Thanks for watching, guys.